Well, welcome to Adam's Music Box. And today's a very sad episode because once again, we've lost a true musical icon and legend, and one whose music has been with me literally all of my life, someone whose innovation has inspired me all of my life, someone whose commitment to philosophy and to music and to purer ways of living has been deeply effective in terms of how it's took shape in my mind and how it's influenced me. And this is, of course, Mike Pinder, the great mellotronist of the Moody Blues, the godfather of the mellotron. And we see him just don't know where my arms are. No, that don't know how this works. But you get the idea. The person who, as I'm looking at my screen anyway, to the left, Mike Pinder. But what's important about Mike Pinder is a very long list. Mike Pinder influenced so many different genres of music, and he did so because of his commitment and devotion to introducing a new and novel instrument to the popular music of the day. And this was, of course, the mellotron. Now, some of you listening out there may not know what a mellotron is, so I'm going to try to explain it. In 1949, a man in California called Harry Chamberlain began working on an organ-like musical instrument, but instead of working in the way that a traditional organ or electric piano would work, it would instead be an instrument that would play tapes of different acoustic instruments. And so Harry Chamberlain went about recording every major instrument in both the orchestral and pop worlds: organ, guitar, solo violin, violin section, cello, celli together, bass, trumpet, horn, trombone, various percussion instruments, just about anything you could imagine. And these tapes were then loaded into this keyboard instrument in a custom housing. And the idea was that if you pressed a key on the keyboard, a little tape head in the actual body of the instrument would rise up, touch the tape, and play the sound of the instrument you want in the exact note that you were pressing. So if you had it set for violin section and you press down on a B flat, it would play a violin section playing a B flat. How novel thus far. Need to fix the chair there. And so that was the basis of the Chamberlain. Now, it was a very heavy, very clunky, somewhat crude, but for its day, incredibly interesting instrument. Now, it was in the early 60s that Chamberlain and one of his associates wanted to start manufacturing devices to be sold abroad. And they were looking at that time specifically for tape heads in England. And the company that they were working with decided to try making a Chamberlain of their own. And this eventually settled on the name Mellotron, and the famous Mellotron Mark II that Mike Pinder and many other famous people played eventually came out in 1963. Now, the Mellotron was distinct from the Chamberlain insofar it was more durable and more reliable, but it was the same concept. Every major instrument you could think of, you select it on a little toggling device, not too dissimilar to how an electric organ would operate. And so if you select violins, you can play violins on the keyboard. And unlike synthesizers, which came out later, the mellotron was fully polyphonic, which means you could play chords, as many as you could hold down with as many fingers, arms, or other limbs as you could muster. Now, what does this have to do with Mike Pinder? Well, Mike Pinder was the person who discovered the true use of the mellotron. He invented the mellotron as we know it. Because when the instrument came out, it was originally thought to be a kind of replacement for a live band. Some of the preloaded tapes were accompaniments, so like a percussion and bass accompaniment, and then you could use the keyboards to play the chords and a solo melody line in a trumpet or in a violin or in whatever instrument you like. And people thought that at bars and pubs you could use it at the homes of wealthy people, something a bit more novel than just a piano or even an electric organ. And at the time, the Musicians Union in the UK boycotted the instrument and tried to get it totally shut down because they thought that for radio programs in particular, it was going to act as a substitute for house musicians, for the house studio bands. But that never really happened. Instead, Mike Pinder happened. So, 1 year after the Mellotron was formed, the Moody Blues became a band in 1964. You had Mike Pinder on the piano and electric keyboards, Graham Edge on the drums, Ray Thomas on percussion, vocals, and flute, Denny Lane, who would later go on to play with Paul McCartney on Wings, on guitar and vocal, and Clint Warwick on bass. And they were your typical blues and beat band of the early 60s, that typical mold of what they would call a British invasion band. And the song Go Now actually became rather popular. But after that, the band decided to change their sound and change some of their members. Pinder was instrumental in bringing in a new lead vocalist, Justin Hayward, who also played guitar, and a co-vocalist who sung some lead and a lot of harmony, John Lodge, on bass. And thus we get the men you see behind me, the classic lineup of the classic Moody Blues. But they didn't just change people, they changed their entire sound and entire way of doing things. And that was because Mike Pinder bought a Mellotron and said, this instrument is going to be at the center of our sound. And the way he played it influenced literally every other Mellotron player. And the way he integrated these interesting, unique, novel, ethereal sounds into the format of a rock and roll band, it changed the history of rock music in Europe and in the United States. Now, he didn't just change the sound of music by playing the mellotron in the Moody Blues. It was Mike Pinder who spoke to his good friend Paul McCartney and John Lennon and said, you guys ought to try this instrument out. They did, and Strawberry Fields Forever became a song renowned for having mellotron in it, particularly the mellotron flutes in the introduction. So the late Beatles, with all of their experimentation, a lot of that is owed to Mike Pinder. Now, in 1967, one could make the argument that the Beatles invented prog rock with the Sgt. Pepper album, but an equally strong argument is that the Moody Blues invented prog or progressive rock with their amazing album Days of Future Past, featuring the hits Tuesday Afternoon and Nights in White Satin. The Mellotron is featured on every single track, and that would be the case for every Moody Blues album in that classic seven. There was Days of Future Past, In Search of the Lost Chord, On the Threshold of a Dream, To Our Children's 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 Children. Say that 5 times fast. Every Good Boy Deserves Favor, A Question of Balance, and of course the seventh album out of those original seven, and that was the one known as Seventh Sojourn. And each of them were created by this lineup. Pinder not only had his mellotron, but in all of their albums, poetry was recited either at the beginning or ends of various songs, most famously at the end of Nights in White Satin. Now, while Graham Edge, the drummer, whose head I am below now, wrote the poetry, it was recited by the voice of Mike Pinder, who you see there. So he had that distinct, dramatic, dignified, almost holy sounding voice that really breathed so much life into these poems. And his love of the mellotron never ceased. He was constantly looking for ways to innovate the instrument. And one of the first things he did, even before Days of Future Past, is he removed some of the sound effects tapes that would have been hypothetically used were the mellotron to be played on a radio show or something like that. And he doubled up on the strings and other acoustic instruments instruments to get a really full-bodied sound. So he'd switch out the tapes of, let's say, a train or a car and put in more string sounds. And that full, rich sound that you hear on the Moody Blues albums is that mellotron. I mean, without the mellotron, of course, the Moody Blues would have still been great songwriters, great singers, but without Mike Pinder and his mellotron, they wouldn't have been the Moody Blues. That's really, he was the heart of the Moody Blues in terms of the sound. He was, in effect, you could picture him, even though he wrote with the other members of the band and contributed directly to all of the sessions, he was like an arranger that comes in and says, right, this is the song you've written. Now I'm going to orchestrate it. And his orchestra was the mellotron, which sounded quite like, in many ways, an orchestra. So we see how he changed progressive rock. Once the Moody Blues started doing what they were doing, and once, thanks to Mike Pinder, the Beatles adopted the mellotron and couldn't get enough of it, other bands like King Crimson, and then Genesis, and then Yes, and before that, Rick Wakeman, who went on to join Yes, would play the mellotron on great songs like David Bowie's Space Oddity, all because Mike Pinder started this trend. In many ways, I compare him to Adolf Sax, the inventor of the saxophone, because although Sax invented the saxophone for one purpose, he ended up inventing an instrument that would be used for a very different purpose. So when Adolf Sax invented his instrument, he thought that it was going to be another orchestral instrument. And there was, in the 19th century, even after Sax's time, precedent for new instruments being invented, such as the Wagner tuba, that became an increasingly common feature at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in Germanic, including Austrian orchestras. But the saxophone never got adopted by orchestras. There are several reasons for it. Some would say that artistically, the people's minds were made up, and that by the time the saxophone was invented, orchestras were so standardized in their instrumentation that there was no room for more. But again, the Wagner tuba shows that isn't entirely true. A more unartistic but more realistic reason is because Sax manufactured all of his own parts and instruments and sold them directly. And all of the other manufacturers of the clarinets and flutes and violins and everything else and the trombones, they hated him for it because he was being more efficient. And rather than become more efficient themselves, they said, destroy him. Just open up news about Wall Street today, and you can see that. And so Mike Pinder, and so getting back to the saxophone, so while the saxophone wasn't broadly accepted in orchestras, even though it was somewhat in the 20th century, it became known in other genres that were emerging. It became associated with rhythm and blues, with jazz, with military music, quite the opposite, but still, because of its ability to project and because of its wide range, it became very popular in military and marching bands. So we see a man who invented an instrument with one purpose in mind, and then a totally different purpose comes to light in terms of how it's actually used. Mike Pinder's mellotron was a bit like that too. The mellotron was thought to be something that would be in a hotel lobby, in a bar, in an expensive restaurant, in someone's home who wanted to show off a bit, in a radio station to replace live musicians on the air. And none of that happened. Instead, what happened is bands like the Moody Blues started a musical revolution, and everyone wanted a mellotron in their band. First in the UK, then worldwide, because they were sold everywhere and they were used by a lot of bands, sometimes as something in the background of a mix, sometimes as a lead instrument, like in King Crimson or the Moody Blues, and sometimes in Genesis and Yes, and sometimes as something to fill things out. Black Sabbath used it, ABBA used it. There's such a long list of people who used it. And Mike Pinder was very special like that. Now, Mike Pinder left the musical world in 1978. So the Moody Blues had their seven classic albums. They took a few years off, came back in 78, recorded the album Octave. And it was in the middle of that album that Pinder said, I've had enough of the music industry. They all remained good friends. There was no animosity. He just wanted to walk away from music. And he did many interesting things once he did. He wrote books about philosophy. He studied many schools of philosophy and philosophized himself. He worked with Atari and other computer makers, delving into the world of electronics, of technological implications for music. And so, even when he stepped away from the music industry, he remained a very busy man and a man whose intellect was very much of the cosmic type. He saw the world in ways that others didn't. He truly believed in peace, he truly believed in freedom, and had very interesting cosmological ideas about how us regular people could achieve that. Very, very touching and interesting stuff. He did do a solo album eventually, and it was released in the 90s. And he gave in the 90s a very long interview, over an hour long. I think some of it used to be on YouTube, and I hope that some of it still is. If I can find it, I'll put it in the description down below. He was someone who didn't say anything into the microphone when the Moody Blues were inducted or indicted, depending on your point of view, into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame a few years ago. He explained later that as one of the oldest fans, there was just sort of nothing left to say, became anticlimactic, but he wished his fans well and let everyone know that he was doing great. He was looking great, as we could see, and just as interesting as ever. Some were spreading rumors that he was ill. We don't know that. What we do know is that he was in his 80s, and we've sadly lost him. But he was such an innovator. The Moody Blues changed the sound of music. They couldn't have done that without Pinder. Mike Pinder changed the sound of the Beatles, which itself is changing the sound of music. Prog rock and the Mellotron, inseparable, but impossible without Mike Pinder. And I'm going to go a step further. I'm going to say that Mike Pinder changed the sound of hip hop. Now, that might seem a bit weird because he wasn't a hip hop artist. He wasn't of the geographical or ethnic background that one associates with the artists that created hip hop. But the Mellotron, at a fundamental level, was the world's first sampler, an analog one using tape. But the idea that one could take pre recorded music and play it like an instrument in and of itself to create something new, that was sampling. That was the Moody Blues. And Pinder showed a viable way that people could use sampled sounds of other instruments, of other recordings, and use that to create new, beautiful art. That's what hip hop artists did, particularly the producers, the DJs. They took existing sounds, existing recordings, they played those sounds like instruments rather than like a recording that you listen to passively, because playing an instrument is an active act. Mike Pinder had his influence there too. And now his influence is once again spreading that universal message that was always so close to him. We'll miss him here on Earth. The music, of course, will live on forever. Beautiful man, beautiful soul, great mind, great musician, amazing innovator. Rest in peace to the wonderful and the never to be duplicated Mike Pinder.